G'day guys, I've taken the Panigale back and I just wanted to do a facts video first before I do a review video, and hopefully just concentrating on the facts that will, if you're a beginner, it'll help you understand a bit more about what it's like to ride a superbike, and if you're in the market to buy the Ducati it might sort of help you make a decision, but I'm going to try and not give any opinion. So first of all, the 1199 Panigale gets its Panigale name from the suburb. The Ducati is based in Italy. Second of all, it's a very expensive bike. It's probably a key factor about this bike. So in most markets, I think it's about 50% more than a comparable Euro 1000cc superbike, and even more. Could be up to double a Japanese superbike, depending on if you can get a deal on them. So in Australia, that means that it's about $29,000 or $30,000 on the road. The one that I've been riding was the S version, which costs even more, so it's another $10,000 on top of that, say 25% more, almost $40,000 in Australia. And that $10,000 gets you full LED headlights, gets you carbon fibre, a front mudguard, gets you Marchesini machine finished wheels, gets you electronically controlled suspension, and it gets you an adjustable Öhlins steering damper. The Panigale is the successor to the 1198, which had the same displacement, so it was a 1.2 litre V-twin, but there are some key differences, some practicality differences. The Panigale actually has a lower seat height and the riding position is more upright. Having said that, the seat is still about 3 inches higher than something like a Ninja 300, but it's a fairly low seat height for a super sport bike. They typically have quite high seats. The Panigale has a wet clutch, whereas the 1198 had a dry clutch. That's very significant because a dry clutch can have a lot more maintenance requirement. So they've departed from the Ducati tradition of dry clutches, gone with a wet clutch. A lot of people think that's wonderful. And then just in terms of the key design objectives of the Panigale, they wanted it to be a lot lighter and a lot more powerful, and they've definitely achieved that. The 1198 was the lightest super sport, I believe, at its time. The Panigale is 10 kilograms lighter than the 1198, and it also has 25 horsepower more. Part of the reason why it has that extra power from the same displacement is this super quadro engine, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the next thing I want to talk about is probably the most striking and unique thing about the Panigale, which is that it doesn't have a frame. The front suspension bolts to the front of the engine and the back suspension bolts to the back of the engine. It gives it a very striking look if you know what to expect from a superbike, and it's not a new design for Ducati because they used a very similar frameless setup in MotoGP. But it's important to say that in that frameless setup in MotoGP was notoriously hard to ride, and I think Valentino Rossi in particular had a lot of problems with it, to the point that the Italians sort of turned on him and they call him Lamentino or Whinger because he was complaining so much about the frameless design. And in MotoGP they've gone back to a conventional frame. However, they have decided to sell this frameless design for the road. You may want to read something into the fact that they've abandoned it in MotoGP, or you may want to ignore that. But it's a very unique aspect of this bike, and I think it's a fairly significant factor. The frameless design, however, does contribute massively to its making the bike light. So it's 164 kilograms dry, and then wet with all the fluids it's 188 kilograms. Whereas almost all of its competitors, I think, are 200 kilograms and more. So it's a very significant aspect of the bike. I don't want to embellish, I'll give those facts. The next very significant thing about this bike is the Super Quadro engine. So Ducati, I think, is historically have favoured V-twin engines. As I've said previously, more cylinders at a given displacement equals more power. So in order for this V-twin to compete with 1000cc superbikes, it needs more displacement. So this is a 1.2 litre 1200cc, and it competes with the 1000cc's in World Superbike and has comparable horsepower by virtue of the greater displacement and the less cylinders, it actually has more torque, which I guess is a benefit of this V-twin configuration. There are other benefits to the V-twin configuration. For example, it allows you to have a narrower bike, and it also allows you to set the engine lower in the chassis, and that enables the bike to achieve better lean angles into corners. I think it's not controversial for me to say there's probably a downside of the V-twin, which is I do not believe it is as smooth as a 4-cylinder. In fact, I wonder even if V-twins are more rough than side-by-side twins, but some people would call that character. So they're just some factors to consider about the V-twin configuration. Probably even more importantly about this Super Quadro engine is that unlike the 1198, this engine is massively over square, so it has a very short stroke and a very wide bore. That enables it to achieve a lot more power from the same displacement. It also means that it loses a bit of bottom end torque, which could be a good thing given how torquey these engines are. It might not be suited to you, but there's some considerations. But it is massively over square. That massive over square may contribute to even more to the roughness of the engine. And it also contributes to the heat. And I don't think it's controversial for me to say this is an extremely hot running engine, probably the hottest engine on the market. On the dash it regularly shows over 100 degrees if you're giving it a bit of stick. So consider that. I think I could say as a fact you almost cook your backside on this bike. If you're interested in the heat issue from an ownership point of view, have a look at some other videos. I'm not going to dwell on it anymore. But what all that means is it ends up being more powerful, about 20 horses at least, more powerful than most Japanese sport bikes. So there's almost two classes in the superbike class. There's these 195 horsepower bikes, and then there's the lower sort of 170 horsepower bike. So if ultimate power is what you want, you need something like this, or an Aprilia, or a BMW. And what it means in just pure specs is it's got 195 horsepower or 145 kilowatts at 10,700 RPM, and it has a huge amount of torque, 132 Newton meters or 97 pound-feet at 9,000 RPM, at a very low RPM. So if you can compare that to a S1000RR, it's got more or less the same power, coming a little bit higher in the rev range, but the torque, the BMW has 20 Newton meters less, or 15 pound-feet less, arriving at a much higher rev. So it's quite a unique engine, and there's a lot for someone to consider if they're in the market to buy it. Now, what all of those specs mean on the road is you will achieve a quarter-mile time if you've ridden well, of about 9.9 seconds to cover the quarter mile, which will put you on par with a Bugatti Veyron, which is more or less the fastest road car ever. And short of a Bugatti Veyron, there is no car on the road that will come anywhere near you. What it means in gears, I find this quite interesting, is that in first gear, I'll give you the top speeds in each gear in kilometers and then miles first. First gear, top speed 116 kilometers an hour. Second gear 153 kilometers an hour. Third gear 196 kilometers an hour. So in miles per hour, first is 72 miles, second is 96 miles, third is 123 miles. Now, this will be controversial, but I've ridden the bike quite hard, and to the best of my knowledge, you cannot ring it out. I'm not talking babying it, I'm talking ringing it out, wide open throttle. You cannot hit redline in first without doing a loop, to the best of my knowledge. And to the best of my knowledge, you cannot do that in second. Maybe an absolute pro rider could, but he would be popping a huge mono by the time he got to 8,000 or 10,000 RPM, where there isn't a massive rush of power and torque. I've double checked that against the notes of the guy that rode the Panigale in the drag race in the Chris Harris video against the Porsche GT2. He said he was wide open throttle in second, but he short shifted it. So yes, it's very difficult to, I'd say it's almost impossible to use all of the power on this road. Well, it is impossible to use all the power of this bike on the road legally, simply because you cannot hit maximum power in first or second, and I definitely couldn't hit redline in third gear. After 8,000 RPM, there's a massive rush of torque and power, and the front lifts quite violently over about 150 kilometers an hour. I have no interest in doing wheelies over 150 kilometers an hour. Maybe if you're an absolute gun rider, you could hold on and you could hit redline wide open throttle at 196 kilometers an hour. So that would be your first opportunity to use the maximum power of this bike. However, if you get caught, you are probably going to jail. The other thing about the speeds of this bike is it is incredibly fast. Virtually every bike on the road today is limited to about 300 kilometers an hour or 186 miles an hour. This bike hits that with ease. Apparently they de-restricted it, and on a straight on a racetrack it hit 310 kilometers an hour and was still accelerating fast. But there's more or less a gentleman's agreement between all the manufacturers where they limit the bikes to 300 or 186. So what happens is, at that speed, the dashboard goes blank, and I think you get a little dash sign on the dashboard, and then the rev limiter or power, the engine electronics start intervening and start holding your speed down. And that's the end of the video, guys. Cheers, bye.